All right, so we're going to continue with The Body Keeps the Score, but D2L, I do put information on every week, whether you have a discussion board or not. If you look on D2L for this week, there are a lot of assessment resources. They're all free, and I provided all of the links to those assessment resources. They're there for child level abuse, for adult assessment of trauma and abuse, for post-traumatic stress, and others. So please just become familiar with the assessments so that you can use them. So that when you are in practicum or internship or on your own, you'll have those to use as resources. And I think that a lot of the resources and the agencies were also talked about in our chapters tonight. So I think there's definitely a relationship there. All right. So we're on chapter 9. Title of this chapter is What's Love Got to Do with It? I was wondering where he was going to go with this, but I think it all comes together. So he begins the process of discussing diagnosis, but in the next chapters that we discuss, he goes into more detail about diagnosis. And when I discuss chapter 10, we'll talk about diagnosis more. And I also brought the DSM with me, and we'll look at how to diagnose, because there still is not technically a diagnosis for child abuse or any kind of child abuse. There's a V code. Most insurance companies don't pay for V codes. So we're going to talk about how to diagnose so that insurance will pay for it. All right. I think that there's a lot of positives and negatives about the concept of diagnosis. And I talk more about this when I teach the DSM course, but I don't teach it very often anymore. But so I think that a lot of times my problem with diagnosis is really, I don't like applying labels to individuals in a way that it will follow them the rest of their lives. So if I submit a label to insurance companies, if I submit a label to their records, and I know those records will go from agency to agency, and they might be shared with 5 different resources or support agencies. Because these diagnoses are no longer just on paper, because they're all electronic, it's very difficult to rid oneself of a diagnosis, even if it's incorrect. And we've talked about a lot of the reasons for incorrect diagnoses with trauma. because there's a lot of symptomology in trauma. And a lot of times that symptomology might fit the criteria for other diagnoses like bipolar. So I think there are diagnoses that are seen as more severe, like schizophrenia. The problem with personality disorders or schizophrenia are that there is a belief that they don't go away. The symptoms of schizophrenia might be in remission, but the diagnosis never really goes away. There was only one time in my life that I misdiagnosed somebody with a severe diagnosis, and that's because they came in with that diagnosis and I confirmed it. Did I tell you the story about the men in black in this class? Okay, so there was a woman, she was about 65. Her husband had died. I specialized in grief and loss, but she was also diagnosed with schizophrenia because she had paranoia. She believed that her phone was tapped. She believed that men dressed in black suits were following her and spying on her, that black cars were following her, that they were sitting outside her house. There was a lot of paranoia going on. And it was all as if the government was, watching her. I thought that there was probably some trauma as well because she lost her husband unexpectedly. So she came to me with the diagnosis from a psychiatrist, but I went through all the symptomology and confirmed it and, started conferring with the psychiatrist. How is the medication working? Is it the right dosage? Everything else. And she was on, of course, all of the antipsychotic medication. But no matter what we talked about, she was firm in the delusions. And about 4 weeks into the sessions, about a month into the sessions, I got a call from a lawyer in DC, and he said, well, Grafton, I know, like he knew my name. He's like, Grafton, I know you're not allowed talking about your clients, and it took me 4 weeks to figure out so-and-so was coming to see you. But I can tell you without a doubt that she is not suffering from schizophrenia because her husband worked for the government and he died under suspicious circumstances, and we are required to basically investigate every person in that individual's life. So she is being observed. So it was kind of an interesting discovery. And of course, I immediately talked to the psychiatrist and told him all of this, and we addressed it appropriately. But these things can happen. I kind of use that example because it's an extreme example. However, one of the things that happens with diagnosis is not only all of the electronic records that follow an individual for the rest of their lives, but the diagnosis also results in a plan of treatment. How are we going to treat this individual? So in one way, I find diagnoses helpful because it does help me plan an appropriate treatment plan. It gives me some guidelines. It helps me to do a differential diagnosis between issues that are very close to one another. So it helps me really refine my understanding of what the individual is struggling with. I also think dual diagnosis is important in addictions. Usually, treatment centers only focus on the addiction, but I think the addiction reoccurs unless they address the comorbid issues. Because a lot of times the addiction began as some form of self-treatment, self-medication. I think a lot more agencies are picking up on this. But if we don't have the right diagnosis, it results in incorrect medication and incorrect treatment, in we may be addressing some symptomology with medication and treatment, but we're never addressing the root issue. It just so happens that the symptomology appears in some other diagnoses as well. So, like we said before, it's really important to get an accurate diagnosis, but a diagnosis can either help us in treatment if it's accurate, but it can also hurt treatment if it's inaccurate. So I think one of the problems that he mentions is that, there is not an exact diagnosis in the current DSM, I think he was pretty upset that they didn't accept his proposed diagnosis, and he proposed it for 2 different DSMs, and it wasn't accepted into either one. And he talks about why, and he refutes it, and this is my favorite line: the manual has become a virtual industry that has earned the American Psychiatric Association over $100 million. So it's $100 million per edition of the DSM. So if they put out a new edition, basically every provider is almost required to buy it, because we have to have the codes, we have to have, any changes that occur if they change the coding process. So it's almost a mandatory purchase. And he asked the question, has it provided comparable benefits for the patients that it's meant to serve? Well, there's a lot of debate on that. When I teach my multicultural counseling class, one of the things I address is a previous president of APA was also on the board for an earlier edition of the DSM. And at that time, homosexuality was a diagnosis. And the only way they could get that diagnosis, which was, of course, bias and prejudice and inaccurate, the only way they could get that diagnosis out was the individual who became president of APA was gay. And that's why he became president of APA, to change the DSM. And so through a lot of work, he couldn't even admit not admit, but come out as gay, that because it was a diagnosis and he could lose his license as a psychiatrist. So through much effort, and it was removed from the APA. But that's just probably the most pertinent example of the misuse of diagnosis through misunderstanding, bias, prejudice. There's a great This American Life episode where that previous president tells the story of how he went about working with others to get that diagnosis out of the DSM. But as we grow, I mean, when we think about it, you know, psychology and counseling and psychiatry's only been around for 200 years. And when we think about, you know, human beings and civilization, that's just, you know, a very minimal amount of time. This whole profession is still in its infancy. So we're still learning quite a bit. So, you know, he does have a section then after talking about diagnosis on how to take a trauma history. And so, like I said, please look at all of the assessment tools and the links on this week's D2L. All the links are there, and you can look at the different assessment tools that are used for this. So it's not just trauma history. I gave you, you know, PTSD, trauma, abuse. Most of these are for children, and there's a separate one for adults. So there's a broad range of resources on D2L for you. A couple of them say, well, you should go through training to use this, but it's still free and the measurement's still there, and there's a manual with most of them. So one of the interesting things that he talked about was borderline personality disorder. So in one sense, we've got a lot of diagnoses that do not fit trauma victims, like bipolar, ADHD, things like that. They may be comorbid in some people, but he found that in most cases, they were a result of a trauma. And, but when he looked at his clients and bipolar disorder, he found that a lot of his clients who had experienced sexual abuse, specifically sexual abuse as children, also had the diagnosis of bipolar or of borderline disorder. Borderline. And so when I think about this, you know, I can usually when I work with children, a lot of times they come in with a diagnosis of like, you know, conduct disorder or some behavior disorder that may be a little more mild, and probably ADHD or now bipolar. They're using that diagnosis with younger ages. They probably shouldn't do that below the age of 12, at least. But I've seen it. And, you know, I think that when I look at a lot of my clients, and I remember a lot of my clients, I think we talked earlier about reactive attachment disorder, RAD. And this is not an official diagnosis either, but it all has to do with Bowlby's theory of attachment. And if they don't build those loving, trusting bonds at a very early age, basically from birth to 2 or 3, it's very difficult to establish attachment, the ability to love and care and have empathy, because they weren't established at that very early first stage of development. And so many times, as that child gets older and experiences the world and possibly more negative environments and experiences, that reactive attachment disorder may evolve into some conduct disorders or ADHD symptomology, and eventually, in the more extreme cases, it could finally result in borderline personality disorder. So it's kind of like there's certain disorders I don't diagnose children with. Borderline is one of them. Schizophrenia, bipolar. So I usually wait until at least 12 or 13 to give those diagnoses. Other psychiatrists who want to medicate a child give those diagnoses at earlier ages. But most everything I've read kind of discourages that. But I think that some of the things that he found out, he created a questionnaire, the Traumatic Antecedents Questionnaire. There's more recent questionnaires on D2L. But I think that one of the questions on that original TAQ assessment was there anyone you felt safe with growing up? And many individuals who participated in that study said no, there was nobody. And, so I think that was one of the distinguishing questions that correlated with borderline personality disorder. So he says, as we later reported to the American Journal of Psychiatry, 81% of the patients diagnosed with BPD at Cambridge Hospital reported severe histories of child abuse and or neglect. And the vast majority of the abuse began before age 7. That's a pretty high, 80%. That's a pretty high correlation, He moves on to talk about self-harm. And, a study they did showed that having a history of childhood sexual and physical abuse was a strong predictor of repeated suicide attempts and self-cutting. So there is a correlation between suicidal ideation and childhood sexual abuse. I think it's 4,000 or 5,000 times more likely in some studies, high percentage. So if you think about like the medical field, like if somebody says, if you eat a certain thing, you have a 40% higher correlation with individuals who get cancer, we'd probably stop eating that. But to say a 4,000 or 5,000% 6% higher correlation. That is almost undisputable. So the cutting aspect, we talked about cutting before, and how it often follows the curve of addiction, and how it releases all types of brain chemicals and brings them into the present, so they're not thinking about past, future, relieves a lot of anxiety, self-loathing, because they're not thinking about that either. So we kind of went through that in another class. He concludes that if you carry a memory of having felt safe with somebody long ago, so at some point when they were children, if they felt safe with someone, the traces of that earlier affection can be reactivated and attuned to current relationships when they're an adult, whether these occur in daily life or in good therapy. However, the individual lacks a deep memory of feeling loved and safe. So if they answer that question, that they never felt loved or safe. The receptors in the brain that respond to human kindness may simply fail to develop. That all has to do with, begins with the mirroring neurons and other receptors. And so when we think about that, it's the ability to love, the ability to have empathy, and all of those also not only correlate with suicide and a feeling of being alone and unsafe, but they also correlate to borderline personality disorder. All right, so it doesn't say it in the book, but since he really talks about suicidal ideation, if they can recall a time where they felt safe and loved, that can be rekindled and applied in the present. I would say the same thing with borderline personality disorder. If they at one point in their lives experience that at an early age, they could draw from that as well and develop trust as an adult or as a teenager. And the ultimate way to help somebody who is suffering from personality disorder is to establish trust and caring relationships, even if it's only one way, to help them feel safe. And when they begin to feel safe and understood and loved and cared about, they often act out. And when maybe a foster family or something like that doesn't understand what's happening, and they return that child and said, I can't take it anymore, that reinforces the distrust. And the child says, see, I was warranted to not trust anybody, to not let my guard down, because they just rejected me again. And this happens over and over again, and it reinforces that disorder and belief in basically the cruelness of humanity. So it takes a long time to establish a trusting relationship, and I'm talking years, but it is possible. And it takes dedication and caring, and individuals kind of have to stick with that child. And in this chapter is the first time he mentions that when he first tried to submit a new diagnosis for this, did not appear in the DSM-4. And he says to this day, 20 years and 4 subsequent versions, the DSM and the entire system based on it fail victims of child abuse and neglect, just as they ignored the plight of veterans before the diagnosis of PTSD, which was recently introduced in 1980. I mean, you might think it seems a long way away, but, you know, I don't. It's 43 years. So in the big picture, it's fairly recent. He goes in to talk about sexual abuse and obesity and clients that he had and another person named Felitti had. And I think that it's not a simple correlation. I think there's a lot of things that go into this. And even though he used the example of obesity, it's more than that. It's any type of coping mechanism that either helps protect an individual in their own belief or deadens the pain of the memory of the abuse. So it could be self-medication, could be alcohol, it's usually either alcohol or an opioid, because they seem to deaden trauma experiences the most. Might be benzodiazepines. And then he talks about how he worked with others, including Felitti, to create the ACE study. And he brings up a lot of the results and says, did an adult or person at least 5 years older ever attempt oral, anal, or vaginal intercourse with you? You probably remember that question in the ACE survey. 28% of women and 16% of men in that study responded affirmatively. That's a pretty high percentage in that study. Felitti says that a lot of times the first kind of effects of abuse are witnessed in schools. And that's why it's so important for, if you're in school counseling, to be familiar with trauma, crisis, the various assessments, what the symptomology is, how it might be misdiagnosed. How many kids are you going to see in a school with a diagnosis of ADHD, borderline, some type of conduct disorder? A lot. And they're probably on some form of medication for it. And yet, if you look at the big picture, there may be some abuse in their history. So he goes on and talks about a client, and Felitti again saw the woman whose dramatic weight loss and gain had started him on his quest. And she told him that she'd subsequently had bariatric surgery, but that after she'd lost 90 pounds, then she became suicidal. So I think a lot of times, I know quite a few clients and close friends who had this surgery. And most of the time, the surgery was effective. However, some other issue arose. One of my friends became an alcoholic after the surgery. And then we dealt with that. And other friends would start using some other coping mechanism, or they would display some other emotional symptomology like depression or suicidal ideation or something like that, because they no longer felt safe or protected. They felt vulnerable once again. So a lot of times a doctor might look at some condition and say, oh, well, you're overweight and you could have the surgery, but it's not quite so simple. There may be a lot of other things going on with an individual. So it's good to make sure that, there are no other issues. And of course, he kind of re-emphasizes that child abuse is our nation's largest health problem. And he talks about that. I was wondering if there were any comments, questions, experiences, or examples with friends, clients.